Hello, my name is Max Otte. I'm an entrepreneur and a fund manager, but I used to be a professor, and I'm in the board of the International Oswald-Spengler Society. The society is inspired by Oswald Spengler's works, but applies state-of-the-art insight and approaches to understanding humanity and world history. We issued a call for papers relating to Spengler for a conference here in the Eifel in Germany. And I was skeptical if there would be enough resonance, but we were surprised to have so many young scientists, but also established scientists interested in Spengler, in his thoughts, in his philosophy. We have participants from China, from South Africa, from Russia, from Canada, from all over Europe. So Spengler research is alive, and the research into the rise and fall of cultures and of humanity and its cultures is very much alive, and I think this is an interesting field to be active in the future. I'm going to talk about Spengler's late work in light of modern evolutionary biology, evolutionary epistemology, anthropology, and sociobiology. And I started writing a few days ago, and the thing kept expanding, but I didn't get to its end. So my plan B was to put you some pictures of books at the end and to relate them to Spengler's work. Plan B didn't work because I was busy organizing, so I have plan C, I have the books here. But honestly, that was one large bit of unfinished business, and I was very glad to hear Greg Sawyer's lecture, because when fictionalism, Feinger, yes, I've heard the name, but fictionalism, I mean, you can call things many names, but I found so much common things there, so I think ours will complement each other as much as the two of lectures on Spengler's reception complemented each other. And some personal notes to start. Books were always valued in my family, although we didn't have so huge economic means, but when I wanted a book, I usually got it. And then I pulled off Ortega y Gasset from my father's bookshelf at 13, and of course, have a slightly pessimistic view, but more of that, they have an anthropological view. They're grounded in ethology, in human nature, and in the facts of life, as Spengler would call it. And Spengler had to wait another 2 years, but I bought this because somehow I came across the title. And then, of course, if you read this in adolescence and you read the West European, however historically he may think and feel, is at a certain stage of life invariably uncertain of his own direction. He gropes and feels his way, and if unlucky in environment, he loses it. But now at least the works of century enables him to view the disposition of his own life in relation to the general culture scheme and to test his own powers and purposes. And I can only hope that men of the new generation may be moved by this book to devote themselves to techniques instead of lyrics, the sea instead of the paintbrush, and politics instead of epistemology. So I am talking about epistemology, but better they could do not. And you all know this quote, but it really sank in, and it did do things with me. And so I kept history and philosophy as a hobby and did the other thing. And then reading him at that point, nearly everything I read made sense. The Metamorphosis made sense to me. I explain why. And many things made sense, and they struck me as being intuitively right, as a ordering scheme imposed on things, and then to interpret things. And I know some people here read it first and then started looking at the empirical data. What is there? Gert, you had a somewhat similar experience. But there was unfinished business. So if you think of what made sense, the Arab culture, that concept makes sense to me. I mean, I don't know a tenth of what you know about the culture, or 50th or 100th, but not everything has to fit for such a concept to make sense. So, for example, the pages about Islam as being the pure form of the Arab or the faith of that culture, that makes sense. And the other things being metamorphosed. Or in Western culture, that our science is pure, but law is not. Made a lot of sense. Our law could be probably constructed as a law of forces and of directions. So pretty much according to Newtonian physics, we could construct a law. Of course, we're in the process of deconstructing Newtonian physics, but that's something else. But one could do that. So it made sense to see how the development of our law was impeded by Roman law. That made sense intuitively to the 15-year-old. And all the culture scheme made sense, the rise and decline of cultures, because cultures do die, and they do die out of inner weakness, not necessarily out of external factors. So all of that made sense, but there was unfinished business. There was unfinished business in understanding Spengler. What about his late works? Where he focused on early and prehistory, archaeology, human evolution. Those works exist in fragments, but Spengler spent the last 10 years of his life on these issues, having become disenchanted with political activism, as you could call it, behind the scenes. Can we find gems in his late work even today? Did it prove as prescient as his grand design of great cultures? Where did we supersede him? Because we know so much more today, even in the past 5 years. Knowledge in those fields has exploded because they're really tied to the natural sciences. So computing power now enables us to spread the genes, to map the spreading of genes around the world. So we do know, for example, that the spread of agriculture from the Fertile Crescent was accompanied by people movements, not on a massive scale, but that really people moved with the technology, but that's not always the case. He spoke of A, B, C, D cultures. A, the isolated swarms, the process of the first step of becoming human, where cultures or movements go in hundreds of thousands of years. 100,000 years is his period for that very early stage. And then there's a primitive culture. That's not yet the early culture. It's a primitive culture. Earth is already the earth of humans, so we're everywhere. And we know that there are others. The Schauen Ahnen, crystal, 10,000 years for such a culture, whatever that may be, we don't know much about. Early cultures, the I arises. We have Sprechdenken, Wortdenken, rational techniques. He calls them amoeba, 3,500 years. And he has three early cultures, Atlantis, Kash, Turan. Of course, that doesn't hold up at all. I mean, there is so many cultures we've discovered, so you can't just say there's 3 cultures there. But Turan is the horse people, the steppe people. There's lots of work being done on them and lots of discoveries. And Kash is the south, and Atlantis, of course, is the west. But who knows? I mean, those 3 as such don't hold up. So let's talk about biologism in history. And I know, Herr Demand, you wrote an article on this. Yes, what fascinated me was Spengler's synthetic mind, the breadth, the depth, the sweep of his explanations, even if quite a few details prove incorrect. I mean, that was, as all know, the critics of the experts in the fields come and did come a lot. But to have a grand design, to test it against reality, it may not hold, but it like a map, it shows you where to dig. That's how Spengler led me, and it led you, Gert. And he led me right in many cases, not in all. If you think about fictionalist or evolutionary biology or evolutionary epistemology, I mean, and Spengler believed that there is a biology, then there's society, and we have ever higher levels of cognition and of intellect, but the facts are there. The grounding, the intellect is a derivative. It's derived from the facts. So die Selbstüberschätzung des Geistes, the self-elevation of the intellect. I mean, the intellect is based on more basic things. And in Greg's discussion, after Greg's lecture, we said we have those programs. We have the facts, which is reality, but we can't see it. There's some facts, there's data out there, and then we have programs to sort those facts. If you really take a unified picture, we have lots of programs. And every program is on a higher level. There's the program in the genes. And that may take a long time to change, it may take a short time. I mean, new experiments just being done in the past 20 years show that sometimes birds mutate within 3, 4, 5 generations. So it can go very quickly even with a gene, which is new. But this would, of course, fit Spengler's view that things come very suddenly. Then the next level of program is the cell. Then there's the organ. Of course, Spengler works about the organ. And then at some point we have programs in the brain of animals, maybe by the species, so those are learned over generations. We know that apes have cultures, some use sticks, some don't. So there's knowledge to be culturally passed on even by apes, by humanoids. So then there's cultural learning, and then in the end there is science, maybe as the torturing of nature, the deliberate pulling out of the facts, and so there's different levels where programs to sort reality are with humans. And in humans, of course, we have the genes, but we may have cultural memes that are deep, that are super individual, and at some point there's the individual. And we always have to remember that the programs, the genetic programs and the cultural programs are the deeper ones. They can be overcome by the mind or the spirit, but they're very forceful and they're very deep. And in 1973, Konrad Lorenz, whom I'm sure I haven't found the reference, but I'm sure he was influenced by Spengler, as pretty much anybody in that generation. But I haven't found any proof. Konrad Lorenz wrote a book, Die Rückseite des Spiegels, on evolutionary epistemology in 1973, and the magazine Der Spiegel wrote that Lorenz finishes his books with deliberations of how to liberate ourselves from biology, how to emancipate ourselves from death. Spengler, the man of the humanities, on the other hand, thought in a biologically stringent way. That is a comment by the Spiegel on Lorenz's book. Spengler acknowledges death of individuals, of cultures, of arts, of sciences. We don't know why cultures die, but we did see them die, and I do see ours dying. Maybe different people have a different perception. Most people would have a different perception, but I see it clearly dying. Time and again, Spengler refers to the cold facts. Contrast this with his poetic language, and you have the mixture that captured so much attention. Here's the poet with a prose that is really amazing, but the basic of his thought is natural science, is evolutionary biology, as much as it was known then. And we've checked this, and Olaf Jöris, an archaeologist, has done an article in our last book on that and has methodically checked the framework there. And then, of course, this was already quoted, consequently, technics is not a wise part of economics any more than economics, or for that matter, war or politics, can claim to be a self-contained part of life. They all are just sides of one active, fighting and charged life. Or Greg Levitsky, to succeed we must abolish our previous notions of politics, economics and cultures as autonomous spheres of inquiry. So it's the same thing. Or modern sociobiology, the ever-present competition in nature and better humanly created systems is based on the fact that life forms are active systems that want something. They need space and nourishment and try to create space for their offspring, genetic and in the case of humans also mental or spiritual, to expand. Expansion is the basic fact of life. Struggle, Nietzsche, whatever you call it, I mean, it's the same thing. It's the movement forward, the motion forward of life. And you see it in the amoeba, you see it in animals, you see it in humans, you see it in cultures. Again, Spengler, technics is the tactics of living, and we've heard that. It is the inner form of which the procedure of conflict, the conflict that is identical with life itself, is the outward expression. One could also call those programs, genetic programs, cultural programs, habits, as you did, Marina. And they might be individual, they might be cultural, they might be genetic, they might be whatever. Each higher layer, of course, is much more fleeting than the preceding one. The higher layers are dependent on the lower ones. To recognize this is not biologism, but the acknowledgement that we as humans are a species and are as such bound and governed by its laws, by the laws of the human species. I mean, war. Spengler says war breaks out between siblings or brothers very easily because they're so similar. How many theories of war avoidance do we have? It breaks out, it can be managed, it can be contained, but the potential is ever there as long as humans in the form we know them as humans are there. Just a very, let's see if I have that book. It's not here. Napoleon Chagnon is a American anthropologist who was also treated very harshly in the 70s by his tribe, the anthropologists. But he spent 2 years with the Yanomami when they were really Stone Age in the 60s. So he really lived there. I mean, it's a fascinating account. Just one episode there, and I've done lots of those readings. And the Yanomami have humor. They have, of course, a primitive religion, shamanism, animate nature, and so on. But about war, there was a socialist theories that people go to war if they don't have enough food or they need something. And so he asked some of the men, there's some people in my tribe who think you go to war because you want the food of the other tribe. And they looked at him and said, yes, we like their food, but we like their women even more. So that was the reason for it. So we go, I mean, you're right in Troy. I mean, so these are universal patterns. We've modified, we've calmed down, but we've probably also sublimized them, but this is one of the patterns. Oh, they have a very managed way of aggression. When one tribe visits the other, they start exchanging. And this is what Spengler says about there's two ways, or the Urhandel is like the Urkrieg. War and trade are not so much different because they're both acquiring things through diplomacy or through force, but it's about acquisition. So when a Yanomami tribe visited another one, the warriors went about and pointed at things. This means, I want this, and I want that, and you gave it to them. And at some point, one tribe visited the other, and there was a repeat or return visit, and then so this is how exchange started. They're all completely self-sufficient and self-contained, but still there's a social significance of trade, a power, a status significance, not so much the economic betterment. So the social, the hierarchy comes first, and the social. So all modern theories of trade, as we know, and 99% of modern economists are wrong, which is a pity because they run the show, but it is my deep belief as an economist. I mean, I have my master's in economics, but obviously I went into business and so on and so forth. But lots of wrong stuff. But they have a managed way of conflict. So, for example, if there's an issue, the men have chest fights. So they sit opposite to each other and they pound themselves with one really vicious punch. And then they see how long they can last. And it's my turn, it's your turn, to the chest. And vicious. If that doesn't resolve the issue, they go to club fights and they beat over the heads with clubs. If that doesn't resolve the issue, then they go to war. But war in the Yanomami case is mostly a raid. So a band of men leaves the village and goes 3-4 days to another village and raids it. So anyway, so these first-hand impressions from, and these are things Spengler thought about. There's lots of readings that one can deepen that in that broad socio-biological view. Another thing, the battle lines in Troy, in the Ilias, is almost the same thing as the Western Indians, the Indians in the American West did. Sometimes they stood for hours on their horses. I mean, the horse culture came late. It wasn't a quiet culture, but they stood for hours bragging before the actual thing started. Same in New Guinea. So those are universal patterns that we have. Even literature or art is very much a socio-biological phenomenon. I mean, it's beautiful, we enjoy it, but it has two functions. And I highly recommend to read The Origin of Stories by English professor Brian Boyd. He's He's an Australian professor. The Origin of Stories, and he analyzes the Odyssey. And basically it says art, literature has two functions. One, to play out fictitious scenarios and to experiment with human relations and with scenarios without actually having to go through. Very eminently usable to explore new realms. Yes, there's the mind, but it has a very direct implication. The other one is to impress. And the status symbol, of course, if somebody, let's say, tycoon employs artists or so on to impress. Or the artist, him or herself, can impress, of course, by art. The Storytelling Animal by Jonathan Gottschall, an English professor in Pennsylvania. Wonderful book about how stories move us, how we think in stories, how our whole thinking is directed. I mean, modern cognitive psychology has deconstructed, of course, us and has shown us how faulty our mind is, how much on direction, on preconceived notions, on gaps in perception it works, and we need stories to tie these things together. So mythology, of course, is a way of understanding nature, of understanding reality, of understanding human relations. In The Horse, the Wheel and Language, David Anthony, fellow Princetonian who is an archaeologist and works at some Boston college, but when I called him up 5 or 6 years ago, telling him I was looking in the early works of Spengler, he disappeared quickly, but who wrote a magnificent work on the horse, the wheel and language, and on the steppe people. And we now know there were 2 or 3 waves, and we can pinpoint them of invasion from the steppe to Europe. And one of them was a very strong exchange of genes. That can be proven by modern genetic technology. So he says, well, the Indo-European people were victors because of 2 factors. One is the superior transportation technology, the horse, of course, the cart. The second one is a superior social technology, the heroic song. If you fight to be remembered in a heroic song, of course, that is a very powerful social technology. Stephen Mython, prehistorian in Reading, England, and dean there, wrote many good books. He wrote one of the Prehistory of the Mind. And in the Prehistory of the Mind, he has the mind in modules. We have a natural history module. We have a language module. Our language skills must be genetic. We have that window between 1.5 and 5 where we just suck up the languages and just it comes natural, and after that it becomes hard work, for most at least, not for everybody. So this is genetically pre-programmed. We pass this on as a species, not individually. And that's pretty well. I mean, there's lots of let's say indications that that's the case. But in these modules, so we have language, we have natural history, we have general intelligence. We also have social intelligence, and he estimates that 60% to 2/3 of our brain are purely social intelligence. Constantly judging where we are in our peer group. That's what our brain does. And then you see how powerful philosophy, how powerful stories, how powerful narratives get. I mean, even today, I mean, rationality is there, but it's very, very limited and very bounded. The directedness of views from cognitive psychology. Jordan Peterson, by the way, has a heroic, he's now a much-read author, self-help. He has 2 books. One is Maps of Meaning. He's in his late 50s. He's written 2 books in his whole life, many articles, many scientific articles. One is Maps of Meaning, where he basically, it's a catalog of all the myths, and it's very good. And the other one is 11 Rules for Life. So Jordan Peterson is a clinical psychologist, but he has a heroic view of the world, and not necessarily Spenglerian, but that kind of conservative. Nietzsche certainly figured in, whatever. There was an experiment. He He tells about where people looked at two basketball teams, and they had to count how often the ball changed teams. And at the end they came up with counts. And they may or may not have been correct, but what they didn't notice was that there was a man dressed as a gorilla in a black costume marching right through the teams 2 or 3 times, and nobody noticed that man. That's how focused we are as a bird of prey, as Spengler would say, with the eye. We have our goal, we go there, we have direction. So, of course, as Edward O. Wilson was his classic, Species, we can set the record straight. This is Chris Stringer from the British Museum, a book, Lone Survivors, How We Came to Be the Only Humans on Earth. I mean, we know there's been quite a few human species, and we are pretty sure Neanderthals and modern humans interbred. Not much, but we have about 3% Neanderthal genes in us. Not all of us, but that depends on the different movements. We also know that our species is a particularly greedy and destructive species. Wherever we arrived, the large fauna disappeared. In Australia, in America, I mean the giant mastodon, the giant whatever sloth, whatever there was, everything disappeared, and also the other human species that did coexist for a while, at least partially. The Neanderthal is, of course, the most obvious example. The cohabitation went for a few thousand years, and the Neanderthals were gone. Although they were stronger. So modern humans must have had a different technology. Edward O. Wilson was one of the first thinkers to point out. Chagnon was one of these people in the revival of sociobiology, and he really was discriminated and given a hard time by his discipline for a while, really denunciated, and it affected his health. He's there, he's in good spirits now, but the late 70s, mid-70s to late 80s for him were very tough. Another one is Edward O. Wilson, the ant expert, the insects expert, truly broad mind. He is now in his 90s, and he in 1977 wrote this classic text on human nature. And Spengler would think that much of this is true. In-group, out-group morals. We do have that. That's programmed in our genes. We have the morals for our group, and we have the morals for everybody else. We can transcend that through very conscious effort, but not for very long, and not everybody. We can try, we may be able to do that, but normally the in-group, out-group, Russia, Poland, Germany, whatever. So the identification with the in-group, with one's own, I mean, but that is what culture is. That is what being is. That is what we have to have roots. We have to have identity. And of course, now we get into identity politics, but we won't. I mean, I guess most of us would share a pretty similar view on identity politics. And this encompassing view of life hit Spengler suddenly. I mean, I invited him, Fabian Mauch. He did some good articles on Spengler, and we talked and we corresponded. But he said, no, he's a young academic. He can't afford to show up with such a conservative group. I mean, this is how far it has come. But so we corresponded. He did a nice piece on Spengler vor dem Untergang des Abendlandes. He wanted to become a playwright. He wanted to become all kinds of things. So the decline must have hit him really. Today, a great number of Spengler's questions have been answered. One is one book that I think is very good, and my wife just read it and she liked it, is Harari's Sapiens, Yuval Noah Harari's Sapiens. He wrote this book after his early semester lectures. He was 28, and we know that sometimes the great designs come at a young age. I mean, Spengler was somewhat older, but it took him time to finish through. So he wrote this pretty young, but it's really a very concise thing about what we know about the developments of humans from the earliest time. I would disagree with Harari for the past 500 years, and probably Spengler would, because those are very much focused on capitalism, on the exploitation of colonies, not so much on the richness of invention of the soul in continental Europe, which of course is the part of our culture that basically is being pushed aside. But it's a very good book. Olaf Jöris, as I said in the volume I handed out, identified many things in Dimension die Technik and compared them to today's knowledge. And so let me conclude with some recent findings. I already talked about how trade develops out of status ideas and not out of material needs. We talked about the start of wars. So the question is that also drove me is what is universal, what belongs to a culture? So Spengler's idea that cultures cannot understand each other, but that maybe a German can understand an Englishman better than the German understands the Arab. So there's a proximity, but there's never total understanding. So what is universal in humans and what belongs to a culture? And to sum it up, I could give you a few examples, but almost everything we do on a basic level is universal, much more than we think, but there's still cores that are reserved to high cultures. So I would also think that pre-cultures, I have to go deeper into that, but the difference to me blurs. Of course, the data there is not so much, but pre-cultures have the same myths. Wherever you look, you have myths of the Great Flood with the Indians, you have it in the Near East, you probably have it in other places. So myths are similar. So even pre-cultures, Spengler had these three, Atlantis, Kash, Turan. I'm not an expert, but I read pretty widely. I haven't seen much difference. I see the commonalities take precedence or are more important. So when really different individuals come up, this is probably really reserved to high cultures. So the plant metaphor for the high culture is probably not so bad, and it's probably really the case that only high cultures have that different ursymbol that really shapes high culture, and that the pre-cultures have similar symbols that maybe worked out a little differently, but not totally different. And what might be different about the West is what you, Greg, said, is that we have this motion of everything that has to be contained, but then it breaks free again, whereas in Egypt and in China the motion is has more of a clear end point and beginning. Language. Language probably had one origin. I mean, there's Goldberg and there's lots of linguistic studies. We can see process of fragmentation and of homogenization in language. So both take place, but in the end, language might have had one origin. Agriculture. Agriculture has multiple origins. That is pretty clearly shown. It started in Africa. It started even with the Aborigines in Australia. It certainly started in Europe. It started in the Fertile Crescent before Europe, and it moved to Europe, but there's not one spread of one technology. It started in China independently, and probably the most sophisticated agricultural technology, although not by Western standards and means, was in Mesoamerica with the cultivation of the maize. So they had there's theories now that even the Amazonas basin of the Amazon River once was a giant garden. I mean, not a extremely neat garden, but that trees were selected, so that even that was a garden, as was the U.S. East Coast, because, and that's pretty convincing, so that the tribes populating the U.S. East Coast burned down the underwood periodically and shaped the landscape to a very large extent. So agriculture, probably the earliest or the most advanced technologies for a long time were in America. And if you think about the potato, pepperoni or peppers, tomatoes, pumpkins, maize, I mean, most of these plants we have as major nutrients today are from America. We also cultivated only about 8 species out of thousands. Only about 8 species were domesticated as domestic animals. So agriculture is culture specific. It now blends. Language started at one point, writing, multiple origins. So this must be in the human program. It must not have been generated by one culture and then spread. I mean, very different origins of writing in China, with the miracle bones, in Sumeria with the counting tokens, and the Maya glyphs have been deciphered in the 70s and 80s. Those are historical chronologies of kings and queens, of kings mostly, and of heroic deeds. So writings, multiple origins. So I guess these are some of the findings that struck me. So I guess the gist is that indeed much of what we did, I mean, we'll probably have to feel deeper into the souls of the pre-cultures, but how to do that if we're so far away? The similarities of the pre-cultures and the myths and the technologies and the social technologies, to me, outweigh the differences. I don't find so many differences, but that might be my position as somebody not really trained in those fields. So in the end, yes, Spengler was a cultural anthropologist or an evolutionary epistemologist. He was a scientist in the best sense of the word, and if he uses grand designs and hypothetical designs, that is only because that is his map, and then, as David Engels did, to show if we dig there, what do we find there? So I think he lives on in many people who don't know that he lives on in them. Thank you.